Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Daniel Culley, and I'm going to start off with a scenario. So, you've got two 30-year-old guys, and they both have ADHD, and it's affected their life. But one of them is unemployed and living in his parents' basement, while the other one is a successful businessman that started his own company. Today, I'm going to be talking about the adaptive value of ADHD. ADHD imposes many disadvantages in modern society. While many people with this disorder will be underachievers, in the right context, ADHD is associated with heightened focus, energy, and creativity, and can therefore actually lead to greater success. Now, with the scenario I gave you the two extremes from the spectrum. But with this project, what I wanted to do was try to understand what were the characteristics that these successful people found advantageous and what separates them from the people who have struggled with this disorder in their everyday life. Now, I'm going to spend some time just talking about what ADHD is and give you some basic information as well as try to debunk a lot of misconceptions. So, ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. If you have ADD, it's just a different branch of this, and it's the same thing but without hyperactivity. So, it is the most common neurodevelopmental disorder diagnosed among children, and it affects 8.4% of children and 2.5% of adults. Now, in the US, cases have been increasing, but the CDC only recognized this as an actual disorder in 1970 and has been collecting data on it since then. However, they only standardized their test in 1997. So we only have about 20 years of solid data that shows it's increasing. And it has shown that there's been an increase from 6% to 10% of children. But whether this is people just becoming more aware of the disorder and starting to test for it more, or if cases are actually increasing is unclear. Now, ADHD is characterized by the inability to stay focused, sometimes hyperactivity if you have ADD or ADHD, and then impulsivity. Now, this has a drastic effect on school and affects younger children far more than it affects adults. This results in younger children often falling behind and then not being able to catch up later on in their educational career. This results in a quarter of them dropping out of high school compared to the national average of only a tenth. And then because they struggle in school, this ends up continuing on into their career and how it affects their finances. So ADHD people, because of their inability to stay focused and organized, often receive lower job performances from their supervisors. And then a study that compared ADHD and non-ADHD 30-year-olds found that they were less financially stable, earned 37% less, and had 66% less in their savings, as well as they were 10% more likely to be unemployed. Now, in the context of career, it's important to look at the way that they perceive themselves versus how others perceive them. So, they often perceive themselves as having increased creativity, they have great multitasking skills and problem-solving abilities. However, people, their coworkers, their peers, their supervisors often perceive them as in chaos and disarray because their desks are normally disorganized. Yes, they might be multitasking, but they struggle to actually complete a lot of these tasks, and you'll find half-started projects everywhere, and they just overall do not seem organized and put together. Now, however, it is important to note that some work environments intensify their symptoms, while others allow these individuals to excel. These tend to be highly stimulating environments with minimal opportunity for distraction. Continuing on, there are a few characteristics of what qualifies as a good work environment for someone with ADHD, and they tend to have one of these four things. So the first is a stressful work environment that is novel and requires multitasking, busy and fast-paced environment, physically demanding and hands-on, or innately interesting. Now, what all of these have in common is that they are constantly changing and every day is always different. They also tend to be very quick moving or innately interesting. Now, I want you to pay attention to the stressful work and innately interesting because this is going to make a little bit more sense later on in the presentation. So now I'm going to spend some time talking about the genetics of this disorder because there is a lot of misconceptions about this, and for a long time people thought that this was something that was caused by too much screen time or some other weird factors, and people didn't even think it was a real disorder, when in fact it is actually caused by a variation in the DRD2A1 allele, and it affects the way dopamine receptors function in the brain, causes them to be dopamine deficient, and affects the reward center of the brain. So the way this ends up playing out in a real life situation is if you have a student that is taking a class in a general education subject that they don't care about, for a normal person, a little assignment, they'll get a little burst of dopamine as soon as they finish and submit it. A ADHD person will not get that same boost of dopamine, and it is a lot harder for them to sit down and focus and get it done. Now, the way you treat ADHD, or well, the most common way ADHD is treated, especially in the US, is with stimulants. Because ADHD is caused by a dopamine deficiency, stimulants help reduce the symptoms by flooding the brain with dopamine. So for a normal person, when they take a stimulant, they'll get really hyper and run around the room. But with an ADHD person, it'll actually calm them down and make it easier for them to focus. So they'll also tend to have dopaminergic tendencies, and they will look for dopamine anywhere they can, and sometimes they'll even self-medicate. So I mentioned before that a stressful work environment was, contrary to belief, actually a positive environment for an individual with ADHD. That's because stress causes adrenaline, which releases dopamine. So when it's stressful, they're able to actually sit down and focus, and it's a lot easier for them to do their job. This also happens to be one of the reasons why ADHD individuals are notorious procrastinators. So leaving something to the last minute ends up being more effective than spreading it out, because that burst of stress that they get when they're running out of time gives them an adrenaline kick that helps them sit down and focus and actually get it done. So the most common medication, especially in the US, is a medication called amphetamine salts, also known as Adderall. So Adderall is a Schedule I controlled drug, and chemically it is one molecule away from methamphetamines. We give this to young children so that to prevent them from being themselves and act normal, so they can sit down in class and calm down. This medication has a laundry list of negative side effects, both short-term and long-term, and the long-term effects can be permanent and affect them for the rest of their life. So ADHD is caused by 75 to 90% of genetic factors, and half of parents with ADHD have a child with a disorder. So it is likely that you'll pass it on to someone, and it is also likely that if you have ADHD, there's someone else in your family that also has it. So the other genetic factors that can cause ADHD are not things like too much screen time that most people believe for some reason. It actually tends to be more like chemical exposure during pregnancy or early developmental stages. This disorder is copable. It is not curable. It's caused by a gene variant. It is not something that comes and goes, or you're feeling more ADHD today. People, especially that statistic I mentioned earlier, where 2.5% of adults, but 8.4% of children, that's because the adults that were diagnosed earlier have either learned a way to cope with it, or they just don't know that they have ADHD. So now I'm going to talk about ADHD in the context of entrepreneurship, because it happens to be one of the work environments that has all four of the characteristics that make for a good environment. A Swiss study led by Johan Wickland published in the Journal of Business Venture Insights, took 14 adult entrepreneurs who were diagnosed with ADHD. What he was trying to do was they're trying to understand what were the characteristics of ADHD that helped these guys succeed in their business, and how they productively harnessed these characteristics. So the first and most important one is something called hyperfocus or flow. So what this is it's a very deep and intense state of focus. Normal non-ADHD people can also experience this. It's just easier for someone with ADHD to get into this mindset. So this state of mind is you essentially forget about everything else in the world except what you're focusing on. Sometimes you might experience it if you're playing a video game and then you realize 6 hours has passed. That's what hyperfocus is. So ADHD people struggle to focus. Everyone knows that. However, it is only when they are not interested in what they're trying to focus on. If they are interested, they experience this intense focus, and they're often able to go without breaks and go for hours at a time just working and getting something done. They're able to spend more, the people in the study reported that they were able to spend more time and energy on their work, and because they were able to hyperfocus, they were able to excel and pass their competitors and their coworkers. So another characteristic of ADHD is impulsivity. So impulsivity is acting with little to no information based off of gut feelings when you think something is novel and exciting. So someone with ADHD has a much easier time making these snap decisions, and it just comes natural to them. In the context of entrepreneurship, this is actually a characteristic that is very challenging for people to learn how to do, and they'll sometimes stress and overthink and not be able to make a decision because they're not able to jump and do something. These guys experience varying success in the study, but that is to be expected with entrepreneurship. Sometimes you make bad decisions, sometimes you make good decisions. So with ADHD, you often have highs and lows with energy, and it will fluctuate to you have a lot. This is the hyperactivity component, where sometimes you'll have a lot of energy, and then sometimes you just can't do anything at all. So the people in the study reported that they had higher levels of energy and working capacity overall, and they required less sleep than the average person, but their energy levels varied throughout the day. And the fact that they ran their own business allowed them to create flexible schedules that helped them cope with low energy times. So in conclusion, ADHD is genetic, it's heritable, and it's here to stay. There's enough individuals, there's a large enough population that this is not going away anytime soon. And varying dopamine levels are a natural genetic trait, but we treat this like a disorder. ADHD definitely has its detriments, but it also has some very real benefits. And it's important to look at this and pay attention to this, because trying to force these individuals to be normal sets them up for failure, when instead we could be finding the right setting that helps them thrive and improves their socioeconomic standing and therefore their quality of life.